The Greek king claimed Syracuse as his own and led the grateful Greeks against the Carthaginians, who were pressed back until they held a single city on the west coast. The Carthaginians offered to relinquish claims to the rest of Sicily as long as they were allowed to hold the one port, but Pyrrhus, confident in final victory, refused the offer. But unable to dislodge the Carthaginians from their stronghold, he decided to attack the North African mother city directly. He ordered the Sicilians to raise an army and build him a fleet for the invasion. But the locals had by this time grown tired of Pyrrhus's dictatorial style and refused. The strength of his army sat by the campaigns in Italy and Sicily, and his rearguard pressed hard by the Romans. Pyrrhus decided to return to the mainland, lest he find himself trapped on the island by the Carthaginian fleet. He would consolidate his holdings in Italy and return to Sicily with a large enough army to drive out the Carthaginians once and for all. So in 275 BC, he returned to Italy and immediately faced a Roman army determined to drive the Greek invader off. They faced each other near Maleventum, and, once again, Pyrrhus's army defeated the legions, but this time, Roman fire arrows had sent the war elephants crashing through Pyrrhus's own line, wreaking havoc and killing a good chunk of his infantry. By now the casualties had mounted up, and Pyrrhus, at his wits' end, decided he had had enough of Italy. He gathered up what was left of his army and sailed back to Epirus. Never had a general won so many battles with so little to show for it. The Romans, delighting in their non-victory victory, renamed Maleventum Beneventum, changing it from the place of bad events to the place of good events. Pyrrhus left behind a garrison in Tarentum, but the Romans quickly overran the outnumbered Greeks and in short order had solidified their hold on Magna Graecia. The Romans now controlled the entire peninsula and had proven themselves to be an emerging power in pan-Mediterranean politics. The East began to wake up to the threat that was rising from Italy. As long as the Romans were confined to the peninsula, the balance of power that had settled in the post-Alexandrian world would hold. But if this new Roman force, which had just driven off a more than able Greek army, led by a man widely considered to be the best general of his generation, decided to expand its horizons, it spelled nothing but trouble for the old powers. The Roman capture of Magna Graecia represented not just another step in Roman expansion, it also effectively brought to a close the era of the city-state in the ancient world. The polity that Plato and Aristotle had held as the ideal form of government was now a thing of the past. The Macedonian conquest of Greece had already ended forever the existence of the independent city-state there, but it had survived in the Greek colonies of Magna Graecia. Now, though, the subjugation by Rome ended any official autonomy for the Greek city-states of Italy, and henceforth politics and government in the ancient world would move permanently into the hands of large empires. The only true holdout was Syracuse, which managed to survive more or less independently until the end of the Second Punic War, but its longevity was only secured by a close personal alliance between Hiero, the king of Syracuse, and Rome. Syracuse would have fallen long before it did. The city-state as a political institution was effectively dead, and Rome had dealt the killing stroke. As for Pyrrhus, he never got the chance to avenge his losses in Italy, and was allegedly killed in 272 BC while fighting in the Greek city of Argos by a tile thrown from a rooftop by an Argead woman. He never won the empire he sought, and his main legacy lay in teaching the Romans how to effectively battle a Greek army and introducing them to war elephants. The Romans, always adapting their techniques, would apply what they'd learned 100 years later when they again met the Greeks in battle. Though the tables would be turned the next time they met, and it would be the Greeks' turn to lose to an invading Roman army, though the Roman victories were far from Pyrrhic, and Greece was conquered easily. Next week, we will take a break from the narrative and jump ahead so that I may present the History of Rome Christmas special. As Rome transitioned from pagan to Christian in the 300s AD, the Emperor Constantine introduced a number of edicts that ensured the success of the conversion, including the eventual choice of December the 25th as the birth date of Jesus. It is a fascinating and still relevant story, and I can't let the occasion pass without telling it. After that, we will be on hiatus for a week, but return after the new year fresh, recharged, and ready to pile headlong into the Punic Wars, the most important conflict in the long history of Rome. Hello, and welcome to the history of Rome. For as far back as I can remember, Christmas has been celebrated on the 25th of December. I'm sure this is true for most of you, and in fact, unless one of you out there is 1700 years old, I'd wager that this was true for all of you. Christmas, as we all know, is officially the birth date of Jesus Christ. But how was it that the 25th of December was chosen from all the dates on the calendar when there is no mention in the Bible as to the exact date of his birth? The 25th of December. Pretty random. Where did that come from? I guess we'd be pretty far off topic if the Romans didn't have something to do with it, so I suppose it won't come as a shock when I say that the Romans had something to do with it. But we have to go back a little further than the Romans even, and work out a little astronomy first to really understand the significance of the date. For as long as there has been civilization, there have been holidays and festivals. Days or weeks where work was put aside in honor of this or that god, and to celebrate this or that seasonal transition. The particulars change over time and place, but there are a few constants that seem to pop up over and over again, not just in Western civilization, but everywhere. For example, some sort of holiday or festival is invariably found at the beginning of spring in celebration of the return of life from its long winter dormancy. In agricultural societies, there is inevitably some sort of harvest festival, with communities feasting on the recently hauled-in bounty. And of course, across time and space, back to the earliest tribes of mankind, there has been some sort of midwinter festival. And the midwinter festival, whatever the particular rituals or traditions, is always amongst the most popular and most anticipated. Waxing somewhat philosophical on the subject, I believe the midwinter festival is omnipresent and omni-loved because it's, well, in the middle of winter. It's cold and dark and there's nothing to do. It's been cold and dark for months, and it will be cold and dark for months to come. Without some kind of pleasant break, people are liable to despair. So communities started gathering around fires and throwing week-long feasts, giving each other presents and decorating everything in sight, all in an effort to break up the dreary months. These days, December is marked by an explosion of colored lights in windows, doorways, and rooftops. I can't help but think that this is a psychological reaction to the dull, gray, colorless winter. I always saw midwinter festivities as a prime example of humans throwing a party just because. It's the middle of winter, for crying out loud. Let's have some fun. But there was always a harsh undercurrent as well. In early societies that lived on the razor's edge between survival and extinction, the winter was known as a time of famine. Any excess livestock had to be killed off before the truly hard months set in. The meat could be saved, but there was no point in having an excess number of mouths to feed. Accompanying this slaughter, and the copious amounts of meat it produced, were the communal feasts, sort of a last blowout before the rationing set in. But midwinter partying for its own sake is, of course, only part of the story. Just as humans have always been finding excuses to have holidays, we have also always had a strange fixation with astronomy. I am not going to bore you with my thoughts on the root causes of that particular obsession, but let's just say that humans love staring at the sky. It did not take long for early astronomers, who, of course, doubled as early priests and shamans, to note cyclical patterns in the movements of celestial objects and begin to attach significance to a few of the more noteworthy points in those patterns. They watched as the days grew longer and longer through the summer, until there was a period when the day reached some kind of maximum length and then began to shorten. Later, there was a moment when the day and night were exactly the same length, and then, as winter came, the night began to last longer than the day, until it reached some sort of peak length and contracted back to a day and night of equal lengths. People began to wrap up all kinds of religious and philosophical meaning in these days, what we now call the summer solstice, the autumnal equinox, the winter solstice, and the vernal equinox. They had no idea about solar systems and tilted axes and revolving spheres floating in space, but they knew something was up and wanted to get in on the action. So they started surrounding these important days with rituals, ceremonies, and, you guessed it, festivals. So now we'll narrow solstice in particular. If humans didn't need a reason to party in the middle of winter in the first place, it certainly wasn't going to bother anyone that now there was. Here the astronomer priests were, telling them that on this one particular day, the darkness that had been spreading for the last 6 months, bumming everyone out, had reached its maximum ebb, and now the light would be ascendant. The worst was behind them, and from here on out, every day would be a little bit lighter and a little bit warmer, rather than a little darker and a little colder. And if that isn't a reason to invent distillation, I don't know what is. So the midwinter festivities began to occur on and around the winter solstice, just as the spring festivals began to hinge on the vernal equinox. And by the time the Romans came along then, there was already a rich tradition of festivities surrounding the winter solstice. They didn't invent anything, but they did have their own holiday calendar, which became the conduit through which these ancient celebrations passed into our own modern era. A long-standing Roman winter tradition, dating to the early Republic, was called Saturnalia, a feast commemorating the founding of the Temple of Saturn. At first the celebration took place on December 17th, but as time passed, Saturnalia grew to encompass a whole week, generally ending on December 23rd, but by the Middle Imperial period sometimes extending as far as our date of inquiry, December 25th. Saturnalia was by far the most popular of Roman holidays, and came complete with large public feasts and a complete abandonment of traditional morality, always a must for the really good parties. Gambling was encouraged where, for the rest of the year, it was frowned upon, and it was encouraged not just for citizens, but for slaves as well, who were treated for the week as real, actual people. In fact, in many cases, a sort of role reversal game was played, where the slaves were treated as master and the master as slave. Roman citizens delighted in the novelty of serving food and running errands, while the slaves enjoyed a brief moment on the couch, humorously ordering their owners about. Those crazy Romans, what will they think of next? As for its connection to Christmas, Saturnalia was also accompanied by gift-giving, the hanging of pine boughs inside the home, and singing in the streets, which corresponds roughly to our caroling, though the Romans apparently did this while drunk and naked, which I am thankful to say is a tradition that died with the empire. But for all its importance and obvious similarities to Christmas, Saturnalia was not the true reason Christmas is celebrated on December 25th. That honor goes to an imported Syrian feast called Sol Invictus, or the Feast of the Unconquered Sun. In the Middle Late Imperium, the Romans began to embrace Eastern sun cults and adopted many of their corresponding rituals and holidays. And when we're talking about worshipping sun gods, the winter solstice is obviously going to be seen as a date of great importance. Sol Invictus honored the sun god for holding fast against the encroaching darkness and celebrated the day he turned the tables on his eternal enemy night and began to retake the sky. The Syrian-born emperor Elagabalus introduced the Romans to the feast around 220 AD and held it every year on December the 25th.